So, welcome back to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. This show is part of the Harbinger Media Network and is sponsored by SEAS. That's the Solidarity Economy Incubator for zero emissions here in Montreal. Today, we're speaking with Esteban Kelly, who is the executive director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. But more importantly, he's someone with 25 years plus of experience with cooperatives and facilitation, who weaves together systemic thinking, movement building, and anti-oppression. His work has touched on food sovereignty, prison justice, queer liberation, and of course, economic democracy, among other things. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Welcome, Esteban.
Thanks so much, Drew. I've been enjoying the podcast so far and happy to be joining as a guest today.
So yeah, thanks for coming on. I guess just to jump right into it, I'm going to ask some sort of $64,000 questions, and I figured if there's anybody who's going to be enthusiastic about answering those, it'll be you, and not very many other people, but certainly
you're taking the privileges of our friendship to the pod. I see.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm all about it. Let's go.
Absolutely pushing the envelope here. So yeah, I guess I was hoping we could just start with a bird's eye view and maybe an Esteban eye view of the U.S. worker cooperative movement, maybe starting regionally or geographically. Can you take us through the different parts of the country and what's sort of going on, big picture in each region?
Probably your audience is familiar with the idea of the ecosystem approach to movement building and the cooperative development and organizing in different ways. And obviously, similar to Canada, the U.S. is a large place when we get into geography, and that's not just true geographically, but in terms of culture as well. And that each part of the country has its own history of solidarity, movement organizing, and its own, I guess, baseline resources for, I don't know, let's just say that we start the conversation at 2004, which is when we founded the Worker Co-op Federation. So if we're just using that as a starting place to say that's the baseline, where were there already dense ecosystems for worker co-ops and some of the social solidarity economy elements that support those? That's probably a helpful place to start if some of the story that we're telling is about where we've come in about 20 years. So 2024, the Worker Co-op Federation turns 20. We're going to be celebrating our 20-year anniversary in Chicago. And it's part of the horizon, the timeline that I keep in mind and thinking, 20 years back and then looking 20 years forward as we're digging into our own strategic planning. So yeah, with that in mind, where do you want to start?
Can we start with the Southwest?
Got it. That's true. I had not heard that. So yeah, in the Southwest, there's that. It's an interesting ecosystem there because the organizing that's happening in, let's say, Colorado, New Mexico is just really, really different than what's happening in Southern California, for example. So I'll just call it the desert Southwest, we're doing more organizing with migrant communities, migrant workers, community-based organizations that are taking in refugees, not just from the border with Latin America, but in the case of Colorado, refugees from sub-Saharan Africa as well. And just doing really interesting co-op development from the community organizing angle. A lot of that is taking approaches that started in places like the San Francisco Bay Area, that were, I don't want to say perfected, but certainly sharpened into top form in places like Brooklyn, work that the Center for Family Life does in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, or in Western North Carolina, what Opportunity Threads and the Industrial Commons have done, working with immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, and building jobs and ownership and cooperative enterprises around a particular community. So that's kind of the model that's being developed. And the thing about co-op development, which is maybe either surprising or disappointing to people who come from other kinds of movement organizing, is just that it's so damn slow. It's really slow. something that's been a co-op project that's in entering its 5th year that's still early, that's still new, that's still nascent, and sometimes they're not even running their first payroll yet. So these projects just take a very, very long time. And a lot of what organizations like ours do, and how we kind of frame the work that we do, is around catalyzing that. Like, how can we take something that would have taken 15 years and condense that to 5? How can we take some of the stuff that currently takes 5 years, given a lack of financing, the limited legal frameworks and systems, a lack of culturally competent training and technical assistance providers? How do we solve for all those different elements, so that a project that might take 5 years to get to its actual launch, maybe we can shrink that down to 2 years or something. So that's how we see a lot of our work, and we use the term catalyzing for that. Yeah.
So what does that look like? I mean, what's the first step in some place? I'm not going to say that the Southwest is a co-op desert, even it's maybe literally a desert, but in a theoretical co-op desert, what would be the first step in terms of in terms of that catalytic?
Well,
organizing?
yeah, it's not sequential. I mean, I think I have a background in ecology, and we use a lot of ecological terms. I think less and less of it as a metaphor, and more as actual instruction, actually instructive for the approach itself. So if you're starting with an abandoned lot, let's say in a city, and your vision is to have a community garden there, to actually grow flowers and food that feed people, and that are helpful for pollinators and whatever else is going on in your neighborhood. Great. So the idea of a first step, well, it depends. Is that lot covered in litter? Do you need to haul a bunch of stuff to the junkyard first, or is it just there and it's fallow and abandoned? So you're starting by building raised beds. Are you starting by putting a bunch of seeds and getting things started in a greenhouse that's completely offsite and unrelated to what's happening with that plot of land? Are you starting by organizing the volunteers who eventually are going to be part of what will be the community garden, or finding people who are already organized and are interested and share that vision, who you can plug into? And any number of those things would be a valid first step. But it's why I tend to hesitate from framing things sequentially like that. I just don't think that that's how this stuff happens. And in fact, the capacity to actually zoom out and do a landscape analysis and say, okay, we're in, let's say you're in Colorado. 20 years ago, they didn't have a particularly robust ecosystem for advancing this kind of work. But given what their ecosystem was, they started by saying, yeah, we could just incorporate a co-op in Minnesota and use their statute, or in Vermont. But what if we make this a place where the legal framework is more friendly to worker ownership and cooperatives? And not only did they do that, they then became the bleeding edge of innovations around cooperative forms. So they started experimenting with this idea of an LCA, which is what I've done. We might talk about this later, in forming a freelancer co-op, which is incorporated technically as a limited cooperative association that allows for investment in different kinds, and to establish a multi-stakeholder cooperative, which is what we needed for this freelancer co-op. And they have attracted some of the most innovative cooperative lawyers, or lawyers who are involved in different forms of social solidarity economy projects in the whole country. And then they formed really strong partnerships with allies, people who share similar visions inside of government. So currently the governor of Colorado is really supportive of employee ownership. I believe he actually sold a company and to his employees, not as a cooperative, but as an ESOP a long time ago, and has been a fan of this. This is Jared Polis, the current governor of Colorado still. So all of those things, like, those are really helpful ingredients. That's very different than what you're going to find in Los Angeles, for example, where they're employing a union co-op strategy. Groups like the LA Union Co-op's initiative, and the work that they're doing with sex workers to form a stripper co-op there. It's just a very, very different thing. That's also different than what's happening with Black organizers with the downtown Crenshaw Mall project, which is in a historically Black community in LA. So whatever, it kind of starts by taking an assessment of what are you dealing with. The same way that I, as a ecologist in a former life, would have started by saying, okay, if we're going to create a management plan for this ecosystem, let's start by baselining and counting and seeing what's currently here. Are there endangered species? What sort of like water and other ingredients do we have? What sort of shade do we have? Are we managing for fires or things that have come through? What are we protecting and preserving versus what are we trying to advance? I think it's very, very similar. It's just that we're dealing with different kind of ingredients than a biologist or an ecologist would, because we're talking about things like legal frameworks, capital, super sexy stuff, Drew. But also community organizing and social capital and leadership and adjacent social movements. Things that we see as conditions for cooperative projects to excel or succeed.
Yeah. So you have different ingredients in each area, and you're sort of have to make up a recipe. You can't just bring your cookbook with you. But let's keep going through the regions. Maybe we can just touch on some of the initiatives that you see sort of happening in different areas. Let's move up the West Coast and then head east.
Sure. So Pacific Northwest, or I actually skipped right over the Bay Area, and I shouldn't. That's been really interesting because historically, and again, going back to our baseline of 2004, the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where we're technically headquartered, and going all the way back to our founding, has been the largest and strongest, most concentrated ecosystem for worker co-ops in the U.S. So there's a lot of stuff going there. I think what's newer are, one, in Silicon Valley, groups like Zebras Unite are really figuring out platform co-ops and multi-stakeholder co-ops, like what other kinds of innovations and experimentation can happen, and how do we organize and infuse solidaristic and cooperative principles into these larger macro economic trends that are happening. So obviously with tech, with gig workers, with different kinds of platforms, nowadays it's a lot of that's around AI. So I've been involved even just recently, in recent weeks, in different conversations around what new cooperative projects do we need to innovate that stave off some of the extractive and harmful aspects of AI, and also how do we harness that tool for the things that we're trying to do. So, for example, to catalyze cooperative development so that things like sample articles of incorporation or bylaws can, how do we accelerate that with large language models, but also using language justice and infusing that into what we're doing, so that AI as a tool is actually useful for diasporatic communities, immigrant and refugee communities in North America, but also our friends all over the world who are involved in new forms of cooperative development. There's also been interest from city councils, places like San Jose, Oakland, and Berkeley, around like what does it look like to partner more closely on an agenda to expand cooperative development, mostly through the transfer of traditional businesses into becoming employee owned. So a whole conversion strategy there that's been backed by municipal government in the Bay Area. There's been partnerships with SEIU, and this is more getting into statewide organizing around organizing nurses into, so taking people who are already in an industry and then partnering to form these new mini federations. So it's almost like a labor federation, and make it more possible for them to become worker owners within their industry.
Maybe if we can just briefly touch on the rest of the regions. There's a whole bunch of topics that you've sort of raised, which I already want to delve into, but I want to sort of keep the conceit for just a second, but maybe just a few sentences about what you see happening in the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest.
Pacific Northwest, Washington State, your homeland. I don't know if I'm supposed to out you in that way to the Canadians that are listening, but Washington State, it's actually one of the best things to celebrate of this past year, that they just enacted the best worker co-op statute in the U.S. So they've updated it. They did used to have a statute. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I know that you had my colleague Mo Mangklang on the pod earlier, and she could give you a whole rundown if people are interested in some of the details of what about that statute has been so helpful, and how that can be instructive for people who are similarly looking to either update their existing worker co-op statutes or to enact one, because of course there's dozens of states that still don't have one to this day. So Midwest, we're actually going to be having the next worker co-op conference in Chicago. That'll be the end of the summer or early fall of 2023, celebrating our 20-year anniversary there. And it's the first time that we're going to be returning to a city that has previously hosted a worker co-op conference. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's been a recent effort and victory in getting the city of Chicago to support a social solidarity agenda, development agenda. A lot of that is anchored by worker co-ops, and a lot of the organizing is there, but it's not exclusive to worker co-ops. It relates to food systems, land trusts, housing, other elements of the solidarity economy as well. And but it's money that is gone from the city itself into a community organization that then is a consortium that is resourcing a bunch of different projects. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's happening all around that area. You'll have to have someone from the Twin Cities maybe share a little bit about what's happening there, for example, because there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And obviously Wisconsin has been a hotbed of worker co-op organizing, also going back to our founding. So a lot of stuff happening in Wisconsin as well. We've recently been looking at a new state chapter actually in the state of Ohio, just kind of partnering with a lot of groups who've been trying to organize for a couple years now and building up to it. And so there's a coalition of people based in Cincinnati, like the Cincinnati Union Co-ops Initiative, which is now called Co-op Cincy, and through Columbus and up into Dayton and Cleveland. And so, the kind of organizing that's happening in all those places is, I think, part of what's interesting about Ohio is that the local organizing is so different, despite the fact that it is one kind of medium-sized state, and yet the tactics of more of an anchor institution approach and some of the work that Evergreen Cooperatives has done in Cleveland versus the Union Co-ops initiatives in Dayton and in Cincinnati, versus more of a kind of Bay Area style entrepreneurial startup co-op development that we see in Columbus, and obviously efforts to catalyze conversions across the state. So yeah, it's interesting because all of those things are happening, and yet they all see each other as part of one community that's trying to organize. One of the groups that we work really closely with in Ohio is the Ohio Employee Ownership Center. So they tend to focus more on ESOPs and that brand of employee ownership, and they're based in Kent, at Kent State University, which is more in the southeastern part of the state. But that one and the Vermont Employee Ownership Center are two of the oldest and most developed and institutionalized statewide employee ownership centers in the U.S. And so that's been part of our coalition for how we are advancing this work. Some of that is trying to get ahead of the new federal funding that's coming down because of the legislation that Senator Sanders got passed a year ago under the Work Act. So this is federal funding that would go towards state employee ownership or worker co-op centers or organizing, creating kind of a foundation or some infrastructure for providing technical assistance and continuing to do a lot of the stuff that Senator Sanders knows has been really effective in the state of Vermont. So we're trying to establish a lot of these centers in places like New York, Ohio, Vermont.
Cool. And you mentioned maybe we can go nonlinear on the geography here, but you've mentioned opportunity threads a few times, um, and yeah, I'm just curious the sort of model that they're doing. What is that, and how is it sort of regionally tied? And I guess I should say, where are they?
So they're mostly so opportunity threads is one particular cut and sew worker cooperative in Morgantown, which is Western North Carolina, not too far from Asheville, and they work with mostly immigrant worker owners to kind of reboot the traditional textile industry, which historically was a big part of North Carolina's economy. Obviously, that stuff has been offshored, and they're trying to reboot an element of it, knowing that we're not necessarily going back. We're not going to time travel to 100 years ago when textiles had the same level of primacy in the U.S. economy. But there is still something that's really helpful, and there's certainly demand and a market for having things that are U.S. made, that are union made, that are cooperatively made, and obviously this is like lives and livelihoods and jobs for a lot of workers in their region. I think what's interesting about their strategy going beyond opportunity threads themselves is that a lot of those same organizers, one of their founders, Molly Hemstreet, is also the founder of something called the Industrial Commons. And what's interesting about that model is that they're thinking much more about their local economy, their community, and their principles than any specific structure of like everything needs to be a pure worker co-op or everything needs to be an ESOP. They're just like, how do we get all of these businesses in our region, like map out our whole economy, the businesses that we like and that share our values, and just connect them up so that we have supply chains that are integrated. We're doing business with each other. We're sourcing from each other, and we're building this is their name. They're building an industrial commons, right?
We can wrap it up on New England. Maybe just one word about New England.
Well, I shared a little bit about Vermont. We had an experiment in Massachusetts and in Vermont of hiring local organizers and just kind of testing out the need, because we've heard from our members for a while. Some of them have formed their own local cooperative networks. Many of them are in the Northeast, although they're all over the country, places like the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance. There's groups in DC, the New York City network of worker co-ops, all the way up through New England. And sometimes they have struggled to maintain their momentum or their organizing. And so we experimented by hiring local organizers in Boston to do some of that work in that ecosystem. And one of our lessons in wrapping up that pilot is really figuring out what is the best place for what our role is. In other words, if we organize this, we call it a peer network, but it's basically a set of federation partners is the kind of category that we've set up in our membership structure, where we organize, we convene all of those local groups. Some of them are statewide. I mentioned groups like the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. Some of them are municipal, like the New York City network of worker cooperatives. So we organize them all together in this group. So what is our role, if any, beyond that? What's our role in partnering and supporting those groups? Let's have a clear understanding of that. But then also, is there a role for us to play when there's gaps in the ecosystem? If there's a local group that collapses, but we know there's a lot of not just local cooperative members who are interested in services or community building, but also an opportunity like in Boston, where they had a progressive mayor elected, and members of ours who've gone on to be elected to city council in Boston, multiple of them. So what does it mean to have the kind of infrastructure for representation, for deliberation, so that we can actually have buy-in and feedback about our priorities and our platforms? So that kind of organizing actually is really important. And I think what we've learned through that process is, while we might have sometimes a temporary role to play in stabilizing local ecosystems, in supporting what's happening, we really think it's best for that to happen on the ground from people if and where there is energy. A lot of the technical assistance and the workplace organizing going inside of every workplace. There just is not anywhere near the capacity we would need to go and do that ourselves. So
Sure.
we'll continue to do the ad hoc version of that we've always done. We get out on the road every year, we visit members, we check in on them. And certainly we show up if there are local convenings, trainings, conferences. In fact, in terms of mobilizations, we just had an opportunity with a progressive funder to subsidize our members to travel to Washington, D.C. for that Gaza solidarity rally. So that's the kind of infrastructure, like when we can lean into what our best and highest purpose is, and it gives us a little more capacity to do that really well, and be prepared for opportunities like that without being distracted by things that might be happening on the ground in various places.
Amazing. Yeah, there's so much there, and obviously we skipped over giant regions of the country and only talked about like one little aspect of one. But I thought it was important to sort of start with a sort of a geographical tour, because I feel like it's so easy in these conversations just to talk about like New York and Philadelphia for like, hours. So it's so interesting to hear about all the different parts of the country. But I guess I wanted to bring it back to like that sort of ingredient list, or the different pieces of the ecosystem, as you were sort of putting it earlier. I heard a lot of different things in there. There's, you mentioned union co-ops, you mentioned ESOPs, which is employee stock ownership plan for the non-US people among us. And then there's, so basically transferring ownership to employees, whether that's in a co-op structure or not. And then you have municipal governments getting involved. You have workers' centers that you can set up. You have progressive funders. You have, I would imagine, all kinds of different movement groups, which you alluded to a little bit, that are going to be a supportive part of the ecosystem in terms of already being organized and being on board with a sort of a redistributive economic justice framework. So you have all these different things. Yeah, I guess I'm curious how you see all those ingredients. When I sort of list them off, I guess first, are there any missing? But then second, are there any sort of connections that you see between those that are sort of worth highlighting, or unexpected? I hate to use the words, but synergies between them. Anything like that sort of comes to mind when I rattle them off like that.
There are a couple things that come to mind. One, and they're kind of on the opposite sides of the spectrum. So one is more on the movement side and one's more on the business side. I'll get the boring one out of the way first, which is that so much of what's lacking and what's needed is like really basic business stuff, like really, really basic. Having a decent business plan, marketing plan, figuring out your branding. You don't need to stick the word co-op in the name of your business just to like, what is that about? You can tell people that you're a co-op, but you don't need to name yourself, co-op. And so, yeah, I think that there are a lot of the tension that I see right now is that there are some groups who are stepping up to fill in a gap in technical assistance on the business side, who are embedded or already part of the worker co-op community, and therefore have trust and relationships and networks, and are able to like speak the language and code switch and sort of demystify a lot of this language. But essentially, we're doing a lot of I don't want to say duplication necessarily, but it is kind of rehashing things that are already figured out. And so I think that there's a dimension of that is needed and helpful and important. I'm grateful for groups like Lyft Economy and the work that they're doing, all of the technical assistance providers in our membership, and throughout the Workers to Owners Collaborative, which is another peer network that our sister nonprofit convenes of a bunch of our members that either do financing or development of different kinds to support worker co-ops. Most of the framework there is around conversions in particular. But ultimately, and it's clear through our policy agenda in terms of strategy, ultimately, I don't know that we need to do as much building of our own stuff when it comes to basic business stuff, so much as just unlocking the existing infrastructure. In other words, there are thousands of small business development centers around the country that are financed by the federal government, by our tax dollars, that exist to explain to you how to set up a business, how to run it, what to do if you're trying to replace a founder who's transitioning out or a key leader, where to get financing, like all of that stuff. They're there for that purpose. And so a lot of our work has been passing legislation to force them to skill up and be competent in worker ownership and cooperatives, so that they can provide technical assistance to our existing community and our future community, because obviously this work is continuing to grow, the way that they can for traditional LLCs and joint partnerships and capitalist firms. Similarly for business schools, legal clinics, I mean, like all of that stuff is already there. So I don't know that it's worth the time, in other words, for many more people in our community to double down on figuring out, how to judge a marketing plan, when you could kind of just show up to a community college and figure out how to do that. There's nothing specific enough about being a worker co-op, in other words, that it needs a new element of business finances or whatever. Now, when it comes to governance, that's different. When it comes to management, that's different. If you're talking about how to manage your finances and do long-term financial planning as a cooperative, there are going to be elements of that are different, but learning how to read a balance sheet and learning how to, get access to capital or whatever, like those things are probably going to be really similar. What sort of interest rate is like, you don't want to take that deal. Those sort of things, I don't think that we need to figure out new toolkits for it necessarily. So a lot of the work we do is around packaging things, making them accessible, recombining them into smaller and digestible pieces. We run a co-op clinic that does technical assistance for our members and for the community more largely. We don't exclusively serve our own members, and a lot of that is around producing these mini guides. We roll out a handful of them every year, new ones. They exist, and it's like maybe 2 pages, and they're easily laid out. They're easy to digest. We do them in multiple languages. And it's not new work. We haven't like sent people off to business school to figure out what the content is, but there's something about the accessibility. And it's why I'm grateful again for groups like Lift Economy, who do that level of interpretation for our community, similar to my co-op. I mean, Aorta does a lot of similar things when it comes to management processes or governance processes, conflict resolution, organizational development. Like, we don't come from the Harvard management school, but a lot of the content is similar stuff, and then we sort of do some of the translation work. So that's on the business side. I think on the movement side, maybe there's like similar pieces, which is I think a lot about how can we be better partners to existing social movements, community-based organizations, and liberation movements. And the more that we show up in those spaces, because we're already in them, because we already support those organizing efforts, the easier it becomes to be ready when the light bulb comes on and they're like, wait a minute, this problem we're facing, there's a cooperative solution to this, to housing or to finding jobs for immigrants in our community, or for figuring out like small businesses that can do green retrofits for residential housing, or whatever the different things are. Then we're there already. So what does it look like to invest in those movements, because they're already at scale, and then be prepared to offer something that is meaningful and useful, so that we're capturing that energy and plugging it into an existing solidarity economy. I think it's similar for things like mutual aid. Like, people are already, they understand that more or less intuitively. But what does it look like to translate that and capture it and be like, there's a way of taking care of people that's maybe less ephemeral and more long lasting, and where we can actually build power, build economic power. And it's not just about meeting a need now, but how do we build power to meet our own community needs for the long term? And so that's, I think, there's some strategy there that I think we could do a lot more work to unpack. Some of that is about how we show up in those spaces, but I think a lot of it, and not to come back to the work I've done with Aorta, but a lot of it is about how do we get our own community internally trained and prepared to be better partners. because I think one thing that we don't necessarily face as often, that one reality that we don't sort of fess up to as often, is that we have different types of leaders in the co-op space. The people who are really advanced in the technical assistance they provide they're not the same as our leaders in feminist and racial justice movements and economic justice movements and labor solidarity movements. Those are not the same people by and large. And so we have to do a lot of harm reduction. We have to do a lot of accountability work for a lot of the, frankly, white-led development organizations who are the ones who can help you with your business plan. They can incorporate your startup. They can help you with your conversion. But then when the request is, hey, we need more of these projects in Black communities, we need more of these projects in whatever communities, in unionized workplaces, that skill isn't there, and there's something that there's like a opportunity that's missed. And so we have a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of our strategy is simultaneously that like internal development to shift those leaders in that group, and catch them up and skill them up, to be more relevant and useful, and in alignment with our values and principles of how we do what we do, while also building up our own leaders. Because, of course, we have so many leaders in this community, or people who are already embedded in communities of labor organizing or of unions or working class communities or Black communities, other communities of color and immigrant communities. And I'm proud to say that that's been successful so far. Our board, I think last year was the first time we had elected a board that was entirely people of color, 50% Black. Like, this is very different from where the Federation was even when I started in 2015 on our staff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just hearing. I feel like there's like a translation issue on in both of those sort of interfaces, I guess, between co-ops and traditional economic, like business development sort of institutions, but then co-ops and movements at the same time. Like, and it sounds like the transition or the translation that needs to happen between co-ops and movements is almost like a time shift or a time scale shift from like, oh God, this is happening right now, we need to mobilize, to like, okay, like what's our like multi-year plan for economic development, which is obviously just like a totally different pace to be operating at. And then obviously the on the other side, on the business side, it's more about culture, anti-oppression, and just like values, language shifting. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I think for the most part, yeah.
I guess another big ingredient that you talk about is this sort of policy piece, and it's been really interesting to watch like all these. I mean, this is happening at the municipal, state, and federal levels. So I just want to, I guess, tackle the municipal part, because that seems like the place where we can get the sort of most action in the short term. Certainly, we're sort of trying to think these things through in Canada as well. But yeah, I'm curious. You've seen a lot of different approaches, and a lot of different city councils sort of take on support for co-ops, either in like some tiny ways and some in like really substantial ways. And I know there's been a lot of, certainly I hear a lot of grumbling out of New York about how that was handled, and where the sort of money went. But I'm just curious, just sort of on a nationwide picture, I guess, what you see as sort of being the best approaches, what you see as being the sort of most successful. And I guess I would ask, yeah, not only like both about sort of getting access to that sort of government, like municipal power, but also in terms of using it well.
Best approaches for getting access to it, using it well. Yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, there's something about the local character of the community that's advocating for these changes that seems to be making more of a difference than I hear people acknowledging very publicly. In other words, I'm trying to think of an example that's not Philadelphia, where I live. There are places where people are really united already, that they either have set their priorities so they're aligned, they've decided what is the small stuff that they're not going to sweat and they're not going to debate publicly, or they've decided that Yeah, for what I mean, for whatever reason, it's like the beef is elsewhere, or there never was beef. And so when we show up to do this work, like we already have a united set of our purpose, and it means that they're stronger advocates. It means that there's a little more staying power when it comes to telling the story of the success of the initiatives, to re-upping funding if things are temporary, and even having a sense of how do we invest these resources strategically, as opposed to there's not enough trust, so we're just going to find some formula to divide the money that goes to my nonprofit versus your nonprofit, which you can understand the ways in which there's already a culture of that, just generally in the US. I'm not picking on anyone in the solidarity economy space, that's just a thing. And so what I've seen is that the places who've been able to do the most with the least are places where there has been trust built, a sense of generosity. So maybe that trust is about like, my organization's not getting the most money, but that's probably going to come back around. Like that's okay. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe we'll get more next time, or or maybe we're getting what we need, or maybe it just means we need to build enough power to fight for more resources. But instead of pointing the finger at each other and being like, oh, my balance sheet looks like X, and therefore you're the problem. I think the other thing is, and maybe this is what you were alluding to when you mentioned grumblings, is this question of accountability. So the efforts that have stayed successful in their coalitions, meaning that they're united, that they continue to advance their work, are ones where there's an internal sense that there's a corrective mechanism built in, that there's, whether it's democratic or whether it's about power, whether it's about specific types of voices represented, there's some element of we're not going to be screwed over by white-led nonprofits who already pay themselves more than most of the other groups who are at the table. And frankly, I think the places where that's gone off the rails, you could look it up, are all places where the best mechanism we have for accountability in this work in the US, which is the US Federation of Worker Co-ops. I mean, we're a project of a bunch of members who came together to found us. We're not a random nonprofit. We're not a nonprofit without a grassroots. Our board is 100% elected from our members, right? Like that's what our role is to do a bunch of things and to do them democratically and accountably. That's what we are. So in the places where we were not part of the table, where we were gate kept out, there are many places where that's still the case. Fast forward a dozen years and they're all complaining like, why does this gone off the rails? Why haven't the riches of what's been invested by the city made any material change for the workers, for the people of color, for the community based and the community rooted organizations here? And I think that that's a big part of it, frankly. So the places where there's a step back and sort of a pause to strategically assess what is going to be the most effective way for us to advance this work tend to be the more successful efforts. And that gives me a lot of hope for where this work is going. And some of that has just been, learning the lessons from places where we did not have those elements included in the design or in the process of how we approach the work itself.
I have to ask because, just speaking as somebody who's tried to manage on a much smaller scale, like significantly smaller scale, but nonetheless tried to manage a sort of national federation with regional components. I feel like that there's real big tensions sort of emerge very quickly. And so I guess being a national federation that's trying to do work on the sort of, more regional or municipal level, how have you sort of navigated what I would imagine are the sort of inevitable tensions between any kind of national priorities and the sort of regional, individuation, and especially as a sector starts to develop, I would imagine that that more and more tensions emerge. I'm curious your approach to that.
Yeah, I mean, my job isn't easy, but also I think I bring a perspective to it around, because I am tied to much larger movements that have been around for much longer. People who respect my work, they might not understand that much of it, but they're like, I don't know, worker co-ops are like barely on our radar. We're fighting imperialism and fascism in all these other ways. We're part of these massive, housing movements, or all these other things, labor movements for that matter. So what helps me in those moments where it starts to feel too small and tight and tense is just snapping out of it and having the perspective and awareness that, like, we need to get along, we need to get our act together, because it's not as if we are the all powerful. There's nothing all powerful about what we're doing. We are still incredibly marginal, a drop in the bucket, and of the movements, and the movements are a bucket in the ocean. Like, so it's just like, get a clue, like, what is the tension about? So I'm not afraid of tension. I'm actually, I often orient to that with curiosity. And I don't just say that aspirationally. It's not every day that it comes up as curiosity. It comes up as frustration. It comes up as a lot of different things. But often I'm like, oh yeah, if there's tension, like, why? Like, so rather than just responding to the tension itself, I'm like, well, what's underneath it? Is this about money and resources? Let's talk about that. And is this about real resources, or, is this about the perception of resources? And oftentimes it is. People presume that because the place that I work is national and is the umbrella for all of the organizations in this work, including ones who act a fool or are unprincipled, or who have not paid their dues in years and have lapsed and drifted away from our membership, and we have to recruit them back. People don't have that nuanced understanding of what's really going on with the Worker Co-op Federation. They just assume that we're as well funded as all of those other organizations. They assume that because we're a nonprofit and we're national, that we're the same as being a charitable nonprofit and a public nonprofit, which is not true, and what distinguishes us from everyone else, right? Like, we are a member-based nonprofit. We're a grassroots nonprofit. And it's part of what spooks a lot of funders from funding us. I've had to sit down and have that conversation with funders and be like, where in the tax code does it say that we're not eligible for any of the things that you're saying? Like, look at our work, look at what we do, and look at the other people who have started to get over their fear and fund us. And that's made a big difference. It's part of why it took us this long to get to the size we're at now. So really leaning into it and getting into, like, brass tacks, like, let's get into some facts. Let's make space, certainly, for people's feelings, but what's motivating those feelings? If there's something real there, let's either, like, address misinformation and misperceptions, or, like, let's hold space for those feelings, which isn't to say that that it's there's a lot of things that are valid. And so I want to find the solidarity there. And oftentimes when I've experienced the tension at the beginning and said, let's get in a room, let's get on the phone, let's have the conversation. By the end of the conversation, where we've landed at is, you now realize that we are allies in the same struggle against the same people who are screwing us over, right? But that's a shift. Like, we should be the most powerful mechanism for addressing the very things that are frustrating you. So instead of trying to tear us down, let's connect and figure out, like, what are we going to do about it, and how do we take this stuff seriously? And by the way, some of the times it is about, sure, that nonprofit acted in an unprincipled way, but let's get some perspective. We're dealing with, like, the rise of fascism in this country. We're dealing with, like, massive levels of corruption and oligarchy, and like this is what we're dealing with here. So, like, does it mean that it's not true that that group was unprincipled? No, but let's be clear about who our enemies are and who our targets are. And we're only going to be stronger if we can correct the unprincipled behavior within our own community and fold them back into our ranks, so that we are stronger to be able to fight the real fights. Like, we have bigger things to sweat here. And so I try to help people get the humbling perspective that I have every time that I open social media, or that I enter into a community meeting around strategy, around global struggles, around things that are happening in other parts of the world that are very much part of the same movement, people who are feeling the impacts of the same global system that we are. And I found that very helpful. It does take a different kind of skill. I come to this as a movement facilitator, as somebody who understands the nuances, not just of group dynamics and facilitation and conflict resolution, but also like I had to study up on all my history. You know, I went to grad school. So I'm a student of social movements. I'm a student of all those things. And that matters too, because it means that in a lot of those moments where I've seen other people crumble, it's because it can feel intimidating to be like, oh no, are you gonna accuse me of being not feminist enough? Or are you gonna accuse me of not understanding anti-Black racism? And I'm like, I don't know, y'all. I've studied everything. So so I'm just not scared, which isn't to say I know everything. It doesn't mean I'm right about everything, but it does mean that I'm not going to run away from a conversation merely because it's charged or there's tension. I'm just like, yeah, let's go. Like what else are we doing? This stuff is all intersectional. It's all related. It's all connected. And if we show up with integrity, there's always the next best way to move forward in building the power to make change.
Yeah, so interesting. There was a conversation that was happening the other day, where I found a really sort of helpful framework, which is just like if you're in a framework of interpersonal conflict, or like accusing each other of being oppressive in various ways, like that's one thing, and then it's another thing if you're saying if you're as part of if you're in a common struggle, and then you see any kind of oppressive behavior or lack of awareness or whatever it is as not so much as a personal fault, but as an impediment to your unity and your ability to organize together. And all of a sudden if you shift it into that frame, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is actually something we can deal with, as opposed to like everyone having to like retreat into their individual, like, you know, self-care cave and lick their wounds and commiserate.
That's part of the resilience we're talking about. It's not just the resilience to bounce back. It's the resilience to endure, to face the music, and not, like you're saying, retreat and lick our wounds, but like the resilience to be like, oh, sometimes people need a vent. And if you get activated by that, or if you push back, like sometimes that's not the move that is going to erode trust. So resilience is also about being able to be like, oh, right now you just need to be heard. And maybe it means I need another space for me to then vent or offload or something. But that, you know, it's like whatever your own resilience practices are, find those practices, right? We do need to sharpen that stuff, because there's only one way to advance, you know, this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just reflecting on that, like, you know, seeing it not as like as part of the conditions that we're facing together, as opposed to, you know, transcendent personal faults or some kind of I don't know, some kind of deep individual guilt or something like that.
I mean, there's a lot of analysis about how that has been part of the tactic to undermine movements for change at the height of their powers, at the height of their connectivity. There's versions of what that looked like in other parts of the world, but in the US, a lot of that came down to COINTELPRO and the FBI, and coinciding with the rise of the nonprofit industrial complex. So how do we sow distrust, fragment things, and then also neutralize it and co-opt people, plugging them into this professionalized field? And despite everyone's sharp critiques, you know, nonprofits, $1 trillion industry, they're not going to disappear overnight. I've found the writing, and this is now going back probably 15 years. Ruth Wilson Gilmore had a piece in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It was very short, but really sharp, really dense. She quotes a lot of Angela Davis in that piece. And talk about getting perspective. This is what I'm talking about. So she says that nonprofits it's not the state, it's the shadow state. I mean, and that's just encoded in tax law. They're saying, instead of giving the money to the government, to the state as taxes, you can defer some of your taxes and instead shift it into the shadow state. They're going to do things on behalf of the state as a proxy to the state, such as feeding people, housing people, educating people, which ought to be the responsibility of a legitimate state, right? So they're acknowledging their own inadequacies and saying, put your money here instead. And then what they talk about in this article is like, yeah, if only. What we're doing, the movement side of this, is a shadow of the shadow state. So to pretend or to be so out of touch, to presume that what we're doing, because it's a lot of what we're in touch with, is most of the nonprofit space. Like, get a clue. Most of the nonprofits, it's faith-based organizations. It's like these like Catholic charities and evangelical. It's schools, evangelical schools and Catholic schools, and most of what's happening is not whichever left movement or progressive movement, nonprofit organization you have a sharp critique of, whether that's environmental or any other kind of, reproductive or any kind of issue. Like, so when we get into actual movement organizations, the very few of them that like mess at all with the nonprofit structure, the idea that this is a shadow of the shadow state, I mean, that is some really humbling perspective. That's a sharp reality check. So what does it then mean to go beyond having that analysis and start to weave that into, what does that mean for our strategy? What does that mean for the kind of formations and how we move? It's true, we're not going to nonprofit our way out of that. That doesn't mean that there's no role for nonprofits. So how do we then think about not nonprofits as a goal, but as an instrument for how we build power? That's why I work at the nonprofit I work at. There's only one nonprofit that I work at. I'm part of a lot of different cooperatives, right? Those are private enterprises, but there's only one nonprofit that I work at, and it is not a charitable one. It is one that is about building power for workers who own their own businesses, their own means of production and reproduction, and can use that by coming together to amplify our voice and influence a lot of other institutions and campaigns around the world around us. So that's one way of going about it. I'm not saying it's the only way. It certainly isn't the only way. But when I have my moments of doubt and about what is it that we're doing with the whole world on fire, it's at least helpful to know that I've thought through with some rigor, what is our theory of change? How is this sequence? It's not up to us to solve everything, but we can certainly pull back enough to do something intentional and smarter that applies the rigor that we have, from the knowledge that we have the benefit of having consumed, rather than it being like, wow, I read that one amazing book by that scholar, that movement scholar, and that was inspirational for my heart, and now let's go and perpetuate all of the systems around us in this like comfortable nonprofit or this government job or whatever it is, but to actually have that matter for how you think about where is your time and your energy going. And I think for a lot of people, that answer has been, okay, let's build a stronger labor movement. For other people, it's like, well, let's build power among poor and working class people. And some of that does need to address the problem of houselessness, or just, organizing the unhoused, and shifting their conditions, or addressing the condition of parents or youth. There's a lot of things let's not confuse some of those activities for what could, from the outside, without an analysis, look like it's mere charity work. The difference of organizing, the difference of mutual aid, the difference of how is this instrumental toward the kind of power building we're going to need to change the conditions of our lives.
Yeah, that question of how to accept on a tactical level the reality, while on an ideological level holding that whole bigger analysis, that an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist analysis that's transformative, and then engage in as the shadow of the shadow state. I think that those are certainly humbling reflections, but tough ones, but so necessary for people who want to not just retreat and try and form some kind of, I don't know, off the grid anarchist collective, but try to transform the system as it currently exists, which isn't, not to knock going off grid necessarily, but
not to knock anarchists either. You would never.
No, I would never. as a long time anarchist. No, I have no idea what I am, but certainly identified with that for a long time.
It's because we've gotten old enough to realize that the label part of it doesn't matter. It's really important when you're 16, it's really important when you're in college, but
it's helpful. Yeah.
Once you're busy doing stuff, at a certain point, it's like, does it matter if I'm a communist or a socialist or an anarchist, or what kind of anarchist? At a certain point, it's like, does that matter given the stakes of what we're doing right now?
Exactly. And just as somebody who has a long, multi-decade history of working in anti-oppressive movements, and obviously sort of deep consideration of those things in a framework of economic justice.
Are you talking about you or
I think
me?
definitely talking about you. So as that person, coming from those experiences, yeah, I guess I'm curious about your reaction and the reaction of the movements you're a part of to this sort of, rapid, it seems to me anyway, rapid and superficial adoption, but also weaponization of sort of anti-oppressive terminology, the sort of some of the concepts that come from gender and racial justice movements by sort of neoliberal actors, there's corporate EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion kind of stuff, but also that's like weaponized in political scenarios by neoliberal forces. I'm just curious to hear your reflections on how you respond to that, but also how the sort of movements that you're part of have responded to that.
Well, I will say that a lot of my perspective on this is pretty consistent from even right before we founded Aorta, which is there was a lot of chatter, especially from college educated people, and I'm not even primarily talking about white people, but certainly college educated people of all different races, about race, class, and gender. It's like, oh yes, race, class, and gender, race, class, and gender. This was already, it was already being co-opted. That process was not yet complete, but that was happening. And this is like in the aftermath of, I graduated college, whatever, over 20 years ago, and then co-founded Aorta. I hadn't thought about it in this timeline, but co-founded Aorta about 7 or 8 years after I graduated college. And I saw this disconnect between people who felt so glib, they seemed so glib about their intersectional analysis, and sort of like amplifying the discourse of race, class, and gender. And then when you looked at any of the theorists, mostly Black feminists, who they were actually citing, Bell Hooks or Angela Davis or Kimberly Crenshaw Williams, Audre Lorde, it was like, are you reading the same people I'm reading? Because they're all talking about, the Combahee River Collective. They're talking about intersectionality as having, you first of all have dropped an entire category. They always talked about race, class, gender, and imperialism. And suddenly we're not talking about imperialism. And by the way, all of these liberal arts kids being like, we're so intersectional because we're weaving all three of these. I'm like, when was the last time any of you have said anything about class? You don't understand anything about class. And whoever was teaching you in your maybe like feminist course that had something to do with ethnicity or maybe religion or maybe race wasn't actually conversant in political economy and history and colonization and imperialism and the war machine. And so when we founded Aorta, it was about bridging that gap. It was about saying, hey, we have all these people who are now entering the workforce. And I don't just mean, okay, they're going to go whatever, do manual labor, but we're entering a workforce where they're becoming journalists. They're on Twitter. They are shaping a discourse. And they're doing so by misrepresenting these concepts. And so there's some political education that we need to do to even catch people up on the class and capitalism and imperialism aspect of this. There's certainly a ton of work to do around bringing any amount of rigor to people's understanding of what intersectionality is or could mean, because they really were like, it means this, but also this, but also this, as opposed to taking all of the elements and understanding how they're mutually constitutive. It should not feel revolutionary that suddenly we're talking about racial capitalism. It's like, that was there the whole time. Like Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson, like that was there. And when I say the whole time, I mean even prior to aorta. And it's only entering left discourse in the last couple years now. So we saw our work as helping people in or the form of however they're organizing. Sometimes it's ephemeral collectives. Sometimes it was nonprofits or labor groups. Sometimes it was national groups. Sometimes campaigns. We've even worked with like people who do study abroad curriculum and tours. And being like, okay, this is maybe a little bit harm reduction, but how do we shift this and more help? So we've worked with every kind of, we've worked with like non-cooperative solar companies that do business all over the world, but saw themselves as having a like a, what is it, like social enterprise kind of agenda, and being explicit about paying fair wages and thinking about climate justice, right? So we do a lot of vetting on the front end, but first of all, it's important to dispel the idea that like we might only work with national groups or only work with nonprofits, which is like definitely not true. The number of church basements where I've been doing political education with frontline communities, formerly incarcerated folks, coalitions of people, etc. So that's aorta. But the idea was, how do we have people who have a set of stated, like how do we capture the victory we've already won? So if people have a stated set of values, but then their actions and behaviors and actual work in the world is not reflecting that, that's just the easy win. We've already done the political education for them to agree and to have their values in the right place or their vision in the right place. Let's actually like bridge that gap. So if they're claiming to be intersectional, but then they're not actually intersectional, there's more work to do there. And clearly that was not happening in their liberal arts colleges. So there's work to do there. But certainly we need to, I just was like, the project of aorta is to call bullshit for all the white people saying that they're anti-racist and aren't, for all the femmes of color who were saying they were intersectional and included class in that. But then the moment you were like, do you really have a class analysis? They're like, good point. I actually don't. Right? So how do we catch all of that up? And then when did we drop the imperialism, the anti-imperialism aspect of all of this? So yes, we need to understand social, political, economic history, decolonization, not as the and also, but help people understand that you can't understand what race is without an analysis of imperialism. It just doesn't make any sense. You can't understand capitalism without it, right? So all of these things, so it's about reclaiming intersectionality and restoring it to its rightful place, which does take a deeper amount of committed revolutionary citation than what a lot of people are getting in a run-of-the-mill gender studies course in a state school or liberal arts college. And then layering into that, like, what does this mean for the moment that we actually live in? What does this mean for understanding our current conditions? And for the first decade of aorta, when we got requests for people working with us, a lot of them were like, we think you do the best DEI work. And first of all, for a couple of years, I was like, what's DEI? I not trolling them. I just genuinely didn't know what that acronym meant, because I came from revolutionary movements. And I just hadn't even heard the corporate terminology for many, many, many years. And then, of course, that got popularized. And I was like, okay. And now it's been remixed a million times. And it's like Jedi because we're putting justice in the front of it or whatever we're doing. But to actually say, you're losing the plot. And we, first of all, will never work with anyone if that's your goal. But if that's the language you're currently using, and your goal is something that actually has some potential for something that is much more liberatory and emancipatory, then we will work with you. We do see that as our work to help bring your whole group along. And certainly, if there's somebody embedded in the organization who has their agenda, and the only way they're going to get their boss to agree to hire us, and this has happened with unions that we have worked with, this has happened with all kinds of national organizations where there's been someone on the inside who said, look, I need you to write the words DEI in your stupid proposal. That's the only way this is gonna get. And once you're in, we can do some work. We can do some real work. But we have a cadre of people inside of this organization who we get it and just like trust and believe we understand this. The last piece of your question, maybe one way that I think about it, or one way to illustrate a dynamic, is the the co-optation that's happened even inside of Black organizing or Black communities, which is the stripping away of left and anti-imperialist and abolitionist and working class elements of what anti-Black racism is. And in some ways, actually, I think this mirrors the sort of project of how do we flatten what anti-Semitism is and conflate it for other purposes by, layering in Zionism and being like, there's nothing to see here, right? That's happened with anti-Black racism as well, and racism in a lot of ways, which is to say, just listen to Black women and just hire Black voices from the same professional pedigree and college training without any actual analysis of the importance of class. Again, not just in your background, but in your analysis. I don't care if you're bougie as hell. I don't care. But if you're coming correct, if you have an experience of organizing, of being in solidarity with colonized people, with working class people, then that's great. And I think there's a certain cohort of this professionalized, whatever came out of the co-optation meat grinder on the other side of it, where everything got collapsed from intersectionality now only means something specific about race and gender, and maybe some stuff about pronouns. But it's all about a glass ceiling or access for a professionalized class who have been told their whole coddled lives that to expect that they should be included in the professional world, and have access to the apparatus of the state. And it's only the whiteness of somebody in power, or only the cis maleness of somebody in power that is the cause for a suburban Black or brown femme to not get access to that. It's a very different kind of analysis to come with. So I experienced that flattening as a form of anti-Black racism, the same way that people, I think right now, are experiencing the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism as a form of anti-Semitism. It's like you can't even bring enough nuance to understanding the condition of Jewish people and the structural and historically entrenched hatred and expropriation and plight of what Jews have experienced around the world, then that is anti-Semitic. So I experience that collapse as a form, as a manifestation of anti-Black racism. And by the way, the marginalization of left Black voices. So to say, listen to Black people, and then to silence people like Mark Lamont Hill or Angela Davis, to silence revolutionary Black voices, or to cherry pick which aspects of what Dr. King has said or of what Bell Hooks has said, and to pay no attention to Martha P. Johnson or James Baldwin in part of the history that we're moving up. What were the projects they were embedded in? What does it look like to lift up the organizing contracts of the communities that they were embedded in? Audre Lorde was not one single poet. She was part of a whole community and movement. That's what produced her. That's who lifted her up. That's why her voice matters. So when we reduce it to this neoliberal, individualistic, cherry-picked thing, that's why we end up landing in that kind of place. And I think why I'm speaking to this in an impassioned way is that it's really important to me that that's not happening in the name of the work that I've contributed to, the work that Aorta has contributed to, that we're clear of co-optation when it's happening, that we're part of a much more revolutionary, actually intersectional liberatory project that has nothing to do with corporate DEI.
Thanks for that. Lots to chew on there. I wanted to talk about the state and national level as well, because there have been some really significant developments. The worker co-op movement has sort of inserted itself into these, some pretty big pieces of legislation. I think nibbling around the edges, obviously, of these big bipartisan, bills and stuff. But I'm curious if you can characterize sort of where that's at, and And I guess how it feeds into the system of growing the worker co-op movement and the kind of power you can build.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces to this. I mean, one is that the fact that there isn't a lot of earned media, that many people who would support these things haven't heard of it. That's strategic. I mean, this stuff wouldn't have passed if it was part of a media discourse where everything gets um, well, torn through the partisan, paper shredder, but also then it gets labeled and it becomes toxic to actually pass and implement. So it's only by going below the radar, which is whatever. Take it. It's like a tip from the weapons manufacturers and the oil, like all the stuff that happens is below the radar. It's because it's not in the headlines, and so there's some strategy to that. The other thing I'll say in terms of the shorthand part of this is that, and I'll give her a second shout out now, that our policy director, Mo Manklang, and I co-authored a piece this year, or in 2023, in the summer issue of Nonprofit Quarterly that answers your question in the form of a short article that does a little more storytelling. So, I can share a little version now, but if people are actually interested in that question, we do have a piece in NPQ that kind of unpacks that a little bit and like, what does it mean to engage tactically with the state and with federal policy as a grassroots movement, and as a movement that generally is like, we don't care about the state. Like, we are like, what does it mean to kind of cede that territory? And so that's some of what we talked about is like, look, if you're doing a large base building thing, it's not gonna like drain all of your resources to spend 10 hours a month engaging in a little bit of policy. Like, if you have 50 organizers, have 49 and a half of them doing your regular stuff. But the same organizations who we can have a whole critique of the nonprofit industrial complex and have a whole critique of the state, they'll still spend 30, 40, 60, 80% of their time engaging with the nonprofit industrial complex and none engaging with the state. Like, what's the logic there? So if we can understand some of the reasons why it might still be helpful to capture the resources of philanthropy, can we not also understand that there could be something tactically useful for either harm reduction or capturing some of the, so what we did to some of the federal legislation that you just cited was, we were like, okay, this thing's going to happen. The CHIPS Act has legs. It's going to move forward anyway. It's a good thing we've made friends with, in that case, it was Congressman Jamal Bowman. Good thing we made friends with him and with his staff in his office, because it gives us an opportunity to slip some stuff in there. Again, take some tactical lessons from the page of Mitch McConnell. Slip your shit in there. And so we did. We were like, great, you're going to put funding toward this stuff. How about some of this goes toward the research or the innovation, the technological innovation that worker co-ops either can do or already do? So yes, do we have members who make high-tech lenses that can be used for all kinds of purposes? Great, let's slip that in there. Do we have members who do machine prototyping? Like, whatever it is that we're doing, like, just be present. At a certain point, it's just helpful to be present. If 100% of our energy goes toward, I don't want to say complaining, but like organizing and mobilizing after the thing has already happened, to be in the streets or to flood the Capitol, like, we're already conceding things prior to even doing the strategic assessment of, is there a way to shape this in a more helpful direction? That is not saying let's all throw down for the state. That's not even saying that we should be trying to run all of our own candidates and put all of our energy there, right? And I understand the reasons why sometimes those tactics get conflated and throughout this whole conversation, we've been very sloppy about the way we've talked about the progressive left versus the actual left versus the revolutionary and, the Leninist and the communist and whatever, right? But so, broad brushstrokes, if you'll permit, I can understand how that gets conflated. But we wrote this piece and we're like, it doesn't actually take that much in terms of resources to just be a little bit present. Like, if we're going to engage with problematic institutions like Elon Musk's Twitter or like Zuckerberg's Meta and all its affiliates, like, we can't take a meeting with a congressional staffer to like find out if there's any way to slip some of our stuff in there so that it ends up in the hands of the workers. So what I mean about economic power. Is that the one, Millennial Falcon move that's going to like explode the Death Star? No. But if there's an opportunity there for resources to come into the hands of workers, or to build up the infrastructure and the institutions that are shaping a social solidarity economy, shouldn't we be present and actually do that? So that's what a lot of that stuff kind of came down to. And by the way, along the way, it gives us some more sophisticated understanding of how does the state actually operate? Like, what is the deal with this, with omnibus legislation, and what are the things that are broken? So yeah, there's a million and one messaging bills and things that have all of our hopes and dreams in it, or some of our compromises, maybe I should say, in how we stop policing, and how we defund Israel, and how we, like, all of those pieces. Great. And so fine, if we can engage in those sort of things too. But tactically, we've now got whatever, half a dozen pieces of legislation passed in as many years that support or name worker co-ops, when previously there were zero in the history of the United States. I do chalk that up to a tactical victory. It's not a huge life-changing watershed moment, but it's still helpful. And it some of that stuff at least loops back to the conversation we were having about the kind of energy it would take for us to develop or reinvent the tools around business support services and business plans and marketing, and how to establish X, Y, and Z, when there's already institutions that are well versed and trained up in how to do that. So some of the legislation we've passed is about unlocking that stuff. It's about capturing some of the things that already exist in the infrastructure, the economic and business infrastructure in the United States, and being like, you know what? Some of this is going toward our people. Some of it's going toward our communities. So that's helpful as well. It's not always, messaging things. And yeah, it's tricky, because at the federal level, it does tend to be things that are a little more airy, and it has the sort of impression of, it's a lot of the language, or it's like, we're instructing the small business services to do certain things, but there isn't appropriations, and there isn't money behind it, and there's not money that's coming to our communities. And that's, I think, why we have this multifaceted tactic, where at the municipal level, it's less money, it's less scale, but often there is real money. And sometimes that's tens of thousands, sometimes it's hundreds of thousands. In a few rare cases, it might be $1 million or a couple $1 million that are coming and that are part of it. And maybe along the way, and I can close on this, it informs our strategy also for working in coalition with other groups who are part of visionary or transformation, who have a transformational view of our economy, which is to say, just transition or economic democracy, some of that stuff. So it's been really easy for us to show up for years and years now, and sign on to things like the public banking legislation in localities like Los Angeles, or across the state, like in Pennsylvania, New York, California, and now federally with Representative Rashida Tlaib introducing legislation. That's a no-brainer. Now, is that going to pass? Turns out no. But now we have language that's been vetted and that can be adapted or introduced at all of these different levels and jurisdictions. Why? Because that helps to finance the kind of projects that we want. We can go out and protest the reprehensible behavior and the PR campaigns to mask the behavior of traditional banks, Citibank, Chase, JP Morgan, etc. Like buying a pride float in order to cover up all the things they're doing to destroy our own communities. Or we could build up our own institutions like public banking and go to them for family finances, for business finances, for all the different kinds of projects that we need to build out infrastructure as part of a just transition within our own communities. So those things always do come together, and we have been successful. So even if something like the Public Banking Act doesn't isn't going to pass in whole with all the different elements that we've put in there. It's still instructive for things like how the Work Act, which Senator Sanders had been working on for a dozen years before it actually got passed, which is real money that goes directly into worker organizing centers for employee ownership and cooperatives, right? So these things, they do relate ultimately. And yeah, I feel inspired for continuing to advance all of this work. And my hope is that someday we can catch up to Canada and the level of funding and support and partnership you guys have to advance your work. So it goes both ways. I know that you guys get inspired by what we're doing in the US, but in a lot of ways, we have a lot of catch up to do with you guys and with so many people around the world.
Yeah, that'll certainly be, I think, a reality check in some ways for people in Canada. Because I did some recent interviews that have yet to be aired, but where there, I mean, I think the view can be kind of gloomy in terms, but I think there's also a looking backwards and saying, okay, well, what are all the ways that we've achieved so much, and how can we take stock of that, even if it feels a little stagnant at the moment. Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight, I guess, from what you're saying, it sounds, I think, a sort of maybe a piece to highlight there is all the relationships that you end up building in relation to vision, but in relation to your sort of peer organizations in sort of adjacent areas, in terms of, when you are focused on policy, then you actually create, not just like, let's get into a room and talk about our vision together, but let's hash out the specifics of what's the first step toward that vision, and then let's go lobby for policy together, and you lobby for mine and I'll lobby for yours, and you create these sort of, I guess material relationships between, progressive leftist institutional actors, that obviously has all kinds of ripple effects going into the future, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wishful thinking on the left about pretending we live in a different time than the one we live in. And it's like, this is the time we live in. These are the institutions and conditions that we have. So yeah, we could be in La La Land with some theoretical revolutionary vanguard workers movement. Like, that's not the moment we live in. And so if we're going to do something useful to advance this struggle that is certain to go beyond our own lifetimes, then let's get real about what we can do to move that stuff in the right direction. And it's not always going to be pure, and it's not going to look like whatever Mao or Lenin or Marx or Malcolm X said in their times. It's about what we can observe in our time, and how do we put our shoulder to the wheel of change and make that happen. So it's certainly not going to happen by everyone digging in just to their local community or their own country. It does need to be internationalist. It does need to be mutualist and in solidarity. And God, we got to give up on all this, like, the moral high ground is everything. Like, we need some actual material power and economic power and some smarter thinking about how we start to build it. Because sometimes it does feel lonely being on the left and actually trying to build power and economic power of things we actually own ourselves. And it's starting to feel like the needle is shifting, which is good. So let's keep moving in the right direction.
Indeed. Yeah, you've been very generous with your time, and I'm just gonna ask one more question, and you can keep it short if you want. But
told you, but abusing your privileges of long friendship.
Absolutely, fully, we'll cop to that. Yeah, I guess just to wrap up, I mean, I was struck by the sort of image of worker owners getting on a bus, going to Washington, D.C., and like moving from the world of like business plans and economic development and marketing and board meetings and all the stuff that goes into building a worker co-op, getting on a bus, going to Washington, D.C., protesting, against this unfolding assault, genocide, ethnic cleansing that's happening in Gaza. What kinds of conversations are happening? What are the bridges between those worlds? And I like, what kinds of capacities does worker cooperation create that brings something to those kinds of movements to, to stop this sort of immediate world historic awfulness that's going on?
Well, the shorter answer, and I think it's something that most of the listeners know, is that it matters to be organized. And that's the biggest piece of it. If you set up your own co-op, you're not organized. Like, it's great that you're organizing your own workplace, but when you connect with a federation of cooperatives, then you're organized. The benefit that unions have is that by joining a union, you're part of the broader everyone else, at least in that industry. And what we're doing as a federation is it parallels that. We have a similar theory of change, and we see ourselves as part of the organized labor movement. And so a lot of it isn't actually that different from the way that unions can mobilize, share information, do the day-to-day work of staying in touch and doing political education and building solidarity, building trust and relationships, which maybe I'll say one more thing about that, because that could sound like just a intangible aspirational thing. But what I mean is, in an environment where there is doubt behind sources, where there is misinformation, where there is propaganda all over the place. I mean, this is a generation who grew up trusting the New York Times. And I'm watching in real time my members learn to be much more skeptical and to actually distrust and to read with a critical eye even institutions like the New York Times, let alone the Jeff Bezos owned Washington Post or et cetera, National Public Radio, NPR. So that's a thing that matters, because and it's in conversation with what I said about those of my members who grew up in a generation of like liberal arts college educated, kind of that world. Like, that's a shift. And the ability to have shifted those folks has everything to do with the kind of trust that we've built, that you trust people who have integrity, who you've been able to be in community with. You see where they stand on issues. You see how they responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, moving their businesses from one type of operations to feeding people, healthcare, being street medics, checking in on one another. Like, that builds a kind of trust that is material, right? And that then translates to moments of, there's so much propaganda and confusion. Who do we trust? How can we go deeper than whatever the grand narrative that, like, there's the bad Trumpies on the one side and there's the good Biden liberals on the other side? And so it's our networks of trust that help people break through and be like, do you notice that none of these people have your back? That actually what we're doing is, like, we need to go even further and cut through a lot of that nonsense. So where are we getting our news from? What does it look like to connect with and trust grassroots reporting and news sources with a more critical eye? So that's actually a lot of what it means to be organized and to have built the kind of trust that we can then have that depth of knowledge and then translate that to mobilization. Now, worker co-ops, what are we talking about? Like, thousands of people? That's cool. It's not millions of people. Like, we're still quite small. But what matters then is that we are still hundreds of businesses. Now, is that thousands of businesses? No. But when we're hundreds of businesses, and then we can come together to influence legislation, to sign on to campaigns, to develop platforms, to pass federal legislation, now we're talking about a level of economic power and political power that is outsized and that does shape the world in a different way. And for all the moral high ground of being an individual on Twitter who's on the right side of every issue, if you're not plugged in and organized with anything, even something as small as my worker co-op federation, then, like, who cares? Like, it doesn't, like, what material impact has that had in the world? So I think that's what matters about being plugged into institutions and then using those institutions to move in the right direction. It's not that simply signing up to be a member of something is enough. It matters that the institutions are democratic, that they are accountable, and that you engage with them so that they become more reflective of the direction you're going in. And that's not to smooth over, like there are, and they haven't been that vocal, but there's a not so vocal minority within my grassroots who have disagreed with the sign-on letters. It wasn't easy for our leadership to come out and say, like, yeah, we are signing this letter even knowing that there's a lot of people who've been propagandized their entire lives, and it's going to piss them off, it's going to alienate them. But what can we do to go beyond the alienation, to lean into relationship, to know that, like, maybe not this month, but maybe months from now, we will have an opportunity to sit down and break bread and have a conversation with them and work on them, to cut through. Maybe it's not in the same moment that the New York Times is screaming at them a bunch of propaganda and talking points that are untrue, but maybe there will be another moment where we can build bridges and connect with them and move them along with everyone else who shares values that we know that they actually share, right? So what does it look like to be in a deeper relationship so that we can move those kinds of things?
Esteban Kelly, thanks so much for coming on and for taking the extra time.
Absolutely, Drew. My pleasure.